In this lab, we're going to explore some of the various ways that assemblies within SolidWorks behave, since that's primarily how you're going to be using it, is to look at and manipulate assemblies of multiple parts. So if you take a look, we've got open the same assembly tutorial that we created last week, and there should be a copy of this for you to use in the assignment folder. So if you aren't quite sure what happened to the one you had last week, you don't need to worry about that. So one of the first things to take notice of is in this assembly file. So in the feature tree, it's showing my two files that are here. So there's a couple ways that you can edit these files within the assembly. So if you remember from last week, if you've got a part file open, and if you wanted to do any editing in context by selecting the features that you need to edit, you can go in and make changes to them there. So for example, if I was going to make this square boss on the original part way too long, I'm going to make this 100 millimeters instead of 100 inches, and then hit B to rebuild my part. Now I've edited this component that's open in my assembly, and when I go back to the assembly and rebuild the assembly, the change is reflected here. So you can go back and forth with, a lot of times it's convenient to have your assembly open and your individual files open for edit. So you can work on them that way. So now if I change this back, the shorter part, it's reflected in my assembly. Another convenient way to deal with parts in the assembly is, say, now I want to edit the green part. I'm going to do the same thing. If you right click on the part, you get this whole big menu of options of various ways that you can manipulate this part. And the very first one in the top corner is to open that part. So from within the assembly, you can open individual components. Same as we just talked about, I can edit or change things in the part file, and then when I rebuild, that should be reflected here after rebuilding in my assembly. If you go over to your assembly file and right click on the part that I want to edit, on the top of the menu right next to open the part is to open the part in position. If I click on that, open position is not what I wanted. What I want is edit part is the one over next to that. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to edit this green part, right click on it, and go over to edit part. And it will gray out the other components of my assembly. And now I'm editing this part in the context of the assembly, same as I was doing before over here with the part open by itself, but without going back and forth between those extra windows. So now I've changed the length back so it is shorter. So I'll rebuild, my assembly reflects there. While I'm still editing this, if I do something like go in, right clicked on the part and go to appearances, I'm going to change the color of this part to something else. Okay, and then in the top right corner, to get out of this editing within the assembly mode and go back to the assembly, now my part change in color is reflected. So that's an easy, convenient way to go back and forth and quickly modify your parts. So another thing to note in the assembly, in the feature tree over here, if I click on one of these parts, there's a couple other view options besides just changing the color and appearances or for editing the part. And one that gets used a lot is this button here that says suppress. So what suppress does, if I suppress this part, so I took that initial part with the round boss on it, and I've suppressed it, and it turns the part and the text gray. And what that does is the assembly basically pretends that that doesn't exist, that that part doesn't exist anymore. It's still in the assembly file, but my view and the ability to make mates and to interact with that part has been taken away temporarily. So if for some reason you need to get rid of a part or something like that, you can use that suppress feature. So I'm going to unsuppress this component again. The component comes back and my mates reappear. So you can suppress individual aspects of a part file also, and not just the entire file. So if you have this assembly open, what you're going to do for the lab activity is we're going to experiment with editing and suppressing certain features and certain mates specifically within this assembly. So right now, if I try and drag the blue part around, it tells me the component's fully defined, you can't move it. And if I try and drag the other component, it says it's fixed and it can't move. So this assembly is fully defined with my parts being located to each other. But what if I wanted to make it so I can move the parts around? So I can, if I right click on one of these mates and suppress the mate, now if I go drag my parts around, they are still constrained by the other mating features that are within the part, but I can move it in this one degree of freedom in this one axis of the mate that I've temporarily suppressed. So that is useful and is a tool that you can use to add relative motion to your parts. So like what I did here, if you suppress the mate holding these features embedded in each other, will let you move them back and forth and experiment with, if you were going to edit this flange size or something to make the part either embed more or less, or to check clearances or something like that. So I'm going to unsuppress this mate again. So back in the feature tree, some of the other things that you're going to play with that are useful is, so suppress makes it act like that part doesn't exist within the assembly anymore. You can't mate things to it. You can't interact with it in any other ways. So in the top of the menu, there's also buttons for hide component and change transparency. So if I had a feature, say, on the inside of this box, and I just wanted to be able to temporarily see where that feature was, if I hide this component, it disappears from the assembly in view, and the icon in the feature tree goes transparent, but the text isn't grayed out like it was when it was suppressed. So that means that these mating conditions are still active, and there's other properties of the part that still exist within the assembly. I've just made it so I can't see it. So if you right click on this part and go back up to the eyeball and go show components, it'll bring it back in. Same thing if you right click and go to transparency, it'll make this part clear so that I can see through it, and maybe that'll let me edit or manipulate what I wanted to be able to see with the part clear. And we'll go, as we get more in depth in this, we're going to go through some of the other things that you can do to change the transparency and the ability to see through parts with some of their different properties. Another thing that's very convenient, if I wanted to do this, a similar thing, I want to see inside of my assembly here. Up at the top in the view bar is this thing that looks like a cylinder that's chopped in half, and what that will create is a section view that lets you look inside of a part. So this plane that's created is showing me a cross section where that is. And over on the menu section on the left, under section, you see it gives you the principal planes within the assembly that you can click through and drag your section plane to different orientations, so that now this section plane button at the top is selected, and I can zoom in and look at this mating interface of where my two parts actually slid together. So if I do the same thing and suppress this mate over on the left, even within the section view, now I can see in the section view where my parts come together. And you can do things like, it makes it really easy if you wanted to, if I go M for measure, if I wanted to see what the distance between these inside walls are, now I can get to those inside walls and be able to see things that are going on inside of my parts that otherwise would be hidden and would be a little bit trickier to find and manipulate. Then to get back out of section view, I'm just going to click this button on the top, and we're back to the regular assembly. So many features, once they're created, rather than erasing them entirely from the model and getting rid of that mate, for example, is once features exist already, you can go in and edit them rather than getting rid of all of them. So I've got my part fully constrained right here. this coincident mate that I just created on these faces is one way to constrain these blocks to each other, but there's a bunch of other ways to do it too. So if I right click on that feature up at the top and go edit feature, on the left in the access menu is showing the different kinds of mates that I can use to apply, and there's a big list of them. And then it also shows these mate selections. So right now the selections are those two faces. So with those two faces selected, the software is giving me the different options for how it can constrain just those flat faces. So some of these options are grayed out. So if I was going to use different features to constrain them, I'm going to click on the mate selections and get rid of those two faces. And now it's looking for something else to form a constraint by. So if I go and choose a concentric mate that I'm going to have you do in the lab, concentric means you've got two circular features and it puts them so that the center axes of them lines up. So I'm going to constrain this in a way such that these outside radii, the outside radius corners are concentric with each other. And now I've gone in, I've edited what originally was a mate holding those two planes to each other. And now the mate definition has changed to concentric, and it's showing that those two edges are locked to each other. So remember if I suppress this mate that's holding the two faces of the boxes lined up with each other, the only way it can move is in the directions that are still existing in the mates that aren't suppressed yet. So if I unsuppress that and it's fully defined again, now I'm going to suppress this coincident mate holding the edges together. So now I've got the coincident mate holding the boxes lined up with their faces, and now I've got this new concentric mate. So now if I drag this box, it moves in the directions that have the existing the remaining unsuppressed mates. So if you had parts that were going to rotate around each other and you use a concentric mate like around a bolt hole or an axle or a wheel or something like that, it'll allow the parts to move like they would move in all kinds of different ways. So we're going to play with that a little bit also. There's one other thing I want to show you, and this will happen a lot, especially when you're working with assemblies with lots and lots of parts, is it's possible to over-constrain your assembly. So I'm gonna try and create a coincident mate that's going to force this box to have the front and back faces line up with each other. And since it was already constrained, I'm getting this error that says, what would you like to do? The mate can't be applied. And I'm going to say, add this mate and over-define the assembly and click OK. And now what's happened is my feature tree is turned all red and angry. And it's showing that there's some rebuild error with these two parts, and there's some error in one of the mates. So if you open the part and you start to get these red error boxes, the software will light up for you where you need to look to try and fix that error. So within this part, if I open the mates folder, it's showing me there's some problem with this mate, and the text is saying that they can't move to that position which satisfies this mate. So if I go into my parts and right click there and I suppress this problem mate, the issue goes away. And the reason that was a problem mate is because this coincident mate was telling the computer that these parts are attached at the edges of those flanges. And this one that I created is trying to attach the front and back faces to be coincident with each other, and it can't satisfy both at once. Those two components can't be aligned so that the faces are both apart and together at the same time. So it's really common that you'll get errors like that if you go in and edit a part and remove one of the features that's used in the assembly as a mating feature. You'll see that, and you'll have to go back and forth and figure out how you either need to reconstrain the parts or how you need to modify the way that you're designing them so that you don't run into those issues. So I'll put this back where it was. One last thing that came up, there was an excellent question during the lab, is how do I easily use two different versions of a part? So in the assembly document, in the feature tree here, we've got the two parts that I'm editing. So if I do what I did before and open up the back part, say, for example, I wanted to have two versions of this part, one version that's blue and one version that's red. So if I go File and choose Save As at the top, I'm presented with this menu of different ways to perform the Save As function. So if you read through those explanations, the first one, if I go Save As, is only going to change the name of the part file, but it's going to leave all of its associations within the assembly, and it's not going to change anything that I've done to design in the file. It's just going to give it another name, and the system is going to update my assembly file. So I'm going to rename this to Save As and save. So now if I go back to my assembly, see, now I've got the part name updated to reflect the new name that I've given this part. And the original part, if I go back to the location where I have my parts saved, shows that my original part is here. There's this part that was originally green. And then when I went through and edited it, it's now updated with this blue part. So one of the things that you're going to go through and do is you're going to save a couple of revisions of a part. And then say I wanted to go back and reuse my original part before I saved it as that. So if I right-click on the part that I want to swap and expand the right-click menu with the arrow at the bottom, you'll see this option comes up towards the bottom, says Replace Components. So Replace Components will let you choose another part file. I'm going to browse to my file location, and I'm going to choose my original file that's green rather than blue, and click OK. And now it's loaded that it's going to change that. I'm going to click OK. Now it gives you a message that you might have to update the mates of the part. If you're importing a round part to take the place of the square one, you're going to have to redefine the mates. So that's what this message is saying, is it's giving you the option to check and verify that your mating conditions are going to work correctly when you import the new part. So since I know that it's set up the same as the other one, if I click OK, it has updated and it's showing that my other part is there, but for some reason it is invisible. Okay, so I just needed to refresh and build the screen back up. So that's how you swap a part back in and out of an assembly. And that is it for this video. So go ahead and go through the instructions that came with the assignment, and we will talk to you later.